Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about the opening paragraphs of Philip Chase's The Way of Edan. I have discussed this with Philip on his channel, but there were a couple of additional points that I wanted to go into more detail here because they're of a more technical nature. And Philip and I had a probably wonderful conversation, and we were focused on slightly different things. So hopefully you can think of this as an addendum of additional information about the prologue. The other thing that you should be aware of is I've had to record the opening little spiel there about 4 times now because I keep having, for some reason, sneezing fits, and there may be a couple of odd breaks through the video because I have to keep editing out when I am sneezing, and I have no idea why I am sneezing so much. But anyway, on to the actual discussion. The two major points that I wish to discuss have to do with the difference between story and plot and chronological sequencing and why an author might play around with that to create different effects. And the second is the difference between exposition and info dumping, and what I mean by integrating the information for the reader into the exposition to avoid info dumping, which we know is blunt and interrupts the flow of information and can feel unwieldy. So those are the two major points that I want to address in this video that are in addition to the points that I raised with Philip over on his channel. The other thing that you should be aware of is that I will probably be referring to Philip all the way through as Chase, because as soon as I put my analytical hat on, I have a tendency to default to that because it's a way of separating Philip, the person I know, from the author, Philip Chase, whose work that I am analyzing. It's part of how you get that step back, I think, to be slightly more objective about the work, to be analyzing it rather than your sort of feelings associated with the person that you know. It's just part and parcel of how I do it. But it does sound slightly disconcerting, and it is slightly awkward referring to Philip as Chase. But just wanted to flag that. Death-like silence descended upon the temple. It began with a hush when Finnan and his two companions approached the steps leading up to the columned building. With each marble step they trod, the merchants and citizens behind them in the courtyard quieted more and more, their loud bargaining and conversing of moments before cut off and forgotten. By the time the three priests reached the top step, an eerie stillness had seized everything. Each of Finnan's laboured breaths seemed drawn out to an eternity, each intake laden with the scent of smoke and spices from the food stalls behind him, mixed with the stench of what he carried. Beneath his white woolen robe, sweat trickled down his back. He tried to steady his breathing and calm his trembling body, and then, in unison with his companions, he turned around. A crowd had formed within moments while Egbert, Data, and he climbed the steps up to the temple, and more onlookers were arriving. Dozens of pairs of dark eyes gazed up at Finnan and his two companions, squinting with curiosity, surprise, and hostility. For a generation, the Kergolese had grown accustomed to missionary priests from Torland preaching on the street corners of Yarfin, but the sight of 3 of them before the doorway of the temple dedicated to their goddess was another matter. Egbert shattered the silence, crying out his sermon. So in the discussion with Chase, I had pointed out, part of this, it's all building toward a rising tension, and then we get that shattering of the silence in that line at the very end there. Egbert shattered the silence, crying out his sermon. And what I find interesting here is when we think of how I've described story and plot being two different things, people, and we do this all the time, we use them synonymously, we use them interchangeably. we talk about them as the same thing. But one of the useful things that we can do is distinguish between them, where story is the sequence of narrative events arranged chronologically from start to finish. And plot is the sequence of narrative events as they are narrated to us in the text. And those two things do not have to be the same, because let's think about the sequence that Chase has constructed in this prologue. If we think of the narrative events, Finan, Egbert, and Data walk into the temple square. They start climbing up the steps. As they climb up the steps, the hubbub of the general market area slowly quietens. A crowd begins to form. They get to the top, they turn round in unison, and they look out over the market square, and silence has fallen on the area. Then Egbert shatters the silence by crying out his sermon. That is the sequence of events. Yeah, but that's what Chase has done here. Except look at that opening sentence. Death like silence descended upon the temple. In that sequence I just outlined of what happens, the market is alive and there's a hustle and a bustle. The priests arrive. People kind of note this and that's curious. As they walk up the steps, more people notice. Conversations slowly start to die away. A crowd slowly starts to form. And it's only when the priests are standing, the three priests are standing in front of this temple, looking out at all of the people in the market who have now gathered round and are looking up at them expectantly. It is only then that the area becomes silent. Silence happens at the end of the sequence. And so what Chase has done is he has taken that silence from the end and put it at the very beginning. Why? Why would an author do this? So let's move it to the end. It began with a hush. They walk up the steps. The courtyard quieted more and more. Bargaining cut off and forgotten. They reached the top steps. Stillness had seized everything. Then a crowd of onlookers forms. And then the sight of the three of them before the doorway of the temple, dedicated to their goddess, was another matter. Death-like silence descended upon the temple. Egbert shattered the silence, crying out his sermon. If silence occurs at the end, then the silence is held from one paragraph to the start of the next. That's it. It is created at the end of the second paragraph and broken at the start of the third. That silence has not held. There hasn't been a tension. There hasn't been the same tension. But by placing the silence at the start, saying, death-like silence descended upon the temple, silence is in place, and then taking a minute flashback, a jump back in time by a couple of minutes, and starting with, how did this silence form? What Chase has done is he has signaled we are going to build to a silence, and this silence is death-like. There's tension there. We're going to build to it over 2 paragraphs. So the silence is being held for those 2 paragraphs. Even though we're hearing about the noise, we know it's ultimately ending in silence. The silence is with us from the very beginning. And so that silence, which is introduced at the very first sentence, is there for 2 paragraphs before it is shattered. And think of the difference then. Death-like silence descended upon the temple. 2 full paragraphs. Egbert shattered the silence. And then contrast that with if it had occurred as it did chronologically at the end. Death-like silence had descended upon the temple. Egbert shattered the silence. You can see that because it's being held for the 2 paragraphs, it has a greater impact. It has a greater effect. If it had been really close together, you're not holding the silence long enough. The silence doesn't have as significant an impact. The silence is created, the silence disappears in a split second, as opposed to the time it takes to read the 2 paragraphs. And that's why I think Chase did this, moved the silence to the start. Even though it changes the chronology. It changes the chronological sequence from story into plot. And this is why how something is written is actually important. But added to that, if we think of this as an exercise, just from this, can we tell what sort of narrator Chase is using for this? Is it omniscient? Is it third person? Is it focalized? All of these different elements. By taking something that happens at the end of a chronological sequence and putting it at the start, that could be read as a signifier of an omniscient narrator, because the omniscient narrator knows everything that's going to happen in the story, and therefore knows that when the three priests walk into the market square, this silence is going to be created. So that narrator can mention it at the beginning. But if it's Finnan's point of view, or Egbert's point of view, or Data's point of view, none of them can know when they walk into the market square that silence will be created. They think it will, they hope it will, their plan is that it will, but they don't know that, and they won't know it until they are standing on top of the steps and looking out. And that's the thing. An omniscient narrator knows. The characters cannot know. They can guess, they can hope, they can surmise, they can predict, but they can't know, and they can't say it with certainty. But that is a conversation for another time. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about was exposition and info dumping. And I'm going to draw your attention to the second paragraph. Dozens of pairs of dark eyes gazed up at Finnan and his two companions, squinting with curiosity, surprise, and hostility. And you can sort of go, well, how would Finnan know? If this is being focalized through Finnan, how would he know how they're looking at him? And it's reading the faces looking at you. That person looks happy. That person looks sad. You don't know for certain, but that's your impression of them. And that's what we have here. So that's not info dumping. That's Finnan's perception of the crowd. But look at the sequence of those words: curiosity, surprise, and hostility. One of these things is not like the others. Again, a technique that authors quite like to use, that stinger on the end of a sequence of two similar that compatible things, and then a third that questions it, a third that throws you off a little. And that's what Chase has done here: curiosity, surprise, and hostility. And because the hostility sticks out as being different, the next sentence is going to explore why potentially these people would be hostile. So if you imagine from Finnan's perspective, he's looking out and he recognizes curiosity on some faces, surprise on some faces, and hostility on some faces. Of those, hostility is the one that you deem most important because you're threatened by it. Curiosity, surprise, these are unthreatening. Hostility is threatening. It's immediately the most important. And so we can imagine that Finnan's mind would immediately think and run through why these people would be feeling hostile. And because of that psychological realism, because of that point of connection, the next sentence, which is essentially exposition solely for the purpose of educating the reader and building out the story and increasing the story world and providing context, that next sentence fits and flows as part of Finnan's experience. It's not internal monologue. It's not meant to be a representation directly of what he is thinking. It's not meant to be a writing down of his thoughts as he is having them. But we can see it flows in sequence with what he might be thinking, and therefore it fits with his point of view. These people are hostile. Why would they be hostile? For a generation, these people, the Kergalese, had grown accustomed to missionary priests like us from Torland, where we're from, preaching on the street corners of Yarfin, this place. But the three of us are standing before the doorway to their temple, to their goddess, and that's different. So this would be the difference between an info dump and exposition, or at least an illustration of a different way of getting across expositionary information without it feeling like it has been jammed in there solely for the purpose of the reader. This is flowing from Finnin's perspective. It matches with what he would or could be thinking about in that moment. It has gone from curiosity, surprise, hostility. The hostility then emphasizes this. Here's the explanation for it. And in this explanation, it's not repeating the things that have already been established, but it is saying the Kergalese. So now we know who these people are. We know the name of the city, the town, Yarfin, because from context we guess, yeah, that's where they are. We know that Finnin and Egbert and Data are missionary priests from Torland. They're from a different place. So we know that they're foreigners in this town, Yarfin, that is part of the Kergalese part of the world. And the three men are standing in front of a temple dedicated to a goddess. So there's contrasts going on. And all of that could have been very badly handled. You could have had a sequence where, and then Finnan remembered, blah, 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 and it would have felt forced. This doesn't feel forced. It has been integrated into the flow of the narration. It naturally fits this place. It doesn't interrupt the sequence of events that we are going through. It is the drawn breath, the moment before the storm breaks. This is the last moment of the silence. This is what is going through Finnan's mind as he is looking out over this crowd that is assembled in front of him, and the silence is reigning over everything. And this will be part of why I genuinely enjoy Chase's writing. I like things like this. Not only do we have the integration of lots of different sensory information, which makes the world stand out, we also have this slow building of tension. We have the use of the seeding of information integrated into the exposition that slowly builds things out and gives us greater and greater appreciation of the different aspects. We don't have everything just lumped down and gone, this is what you need to know, which we saw in R.A. Salvatore's Dritz book, Streams of Silver. Oh, the Icewind Dale book, whichever one that I looked at. You could see that there was a dump of information. Here's the information that you need to know about this. And it wasn't really from the perspective of the point of view. It was just information for the reader. We don't have a sort of hyphenated clause dropped into the middle of a sentence to go, for those of you that have forgotten, I'm going to remind you that this is an artificial story and I'm going to take you out of it to go, here's the information you need about this character, which again is a very forced, mechanical and ungainly way to do this. This is a way, Chase has used a way to integrate the information into the exposition. And because of that, it flows better. It doesn't interrupt the flow of the scene. It's not an interruption. It doesn't arrest the reading. It feels part of the sequence. Anyway, I hope this adds to the discussion I had with Philip Chase on this channel. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.